Okay, I think we'll begin. Good morning and bonjour. Welcome to the 9th and final session of Gwillim Online, Environment, Architecture, Climate. Bienvenue à la 9e et dernière présentation du projet Gwillim virtuel. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that even though we are meeting in the indefinable space of the internet, we are tied to our particular places. McGill University is situated on the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka, a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. We recognize and respect the Kanien'kehá:ka as the traditional custodians of the lands and the waters on which we meet today. My name is Victoria Dickinson, and I am the convener of the Gwillim Project. I'm delighted to welcome you to this event. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, this is the final session in a series of 9 webinars, which have explored the unpublished correspondence and artwork of Lady Elizabeth Gwillim and her sister Mary Simons. The two women moved to India in 1801 when Elizabeth's husband, Sir Henry Gwillim, was appointed a puisne judge in the Supreme Court in Madras. The Gwillim Project, Women, Environment, and Networks of Knowledge and Exchange in the Company Raj, is a research initiative of the Rare Books and Special Collections branch of the McGill Library in Montreal. It's funded through a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada and the Shastri Indo-Canadian Institute. The Blacker Wood Collection at McGill holds paintings of bird, fish, and flowers by Elizabeth Gwillim, while Mary Simons' wonderful portraits and landscapes are held by the South Asia Collection Museum in Norwich. The sisters' rich correspondence to family and friends is in the British Library. This project then brings together virtually the Gwillim Archive, but also an international network of scholars from diverse fields in Canada, the UK, India, and the United States. A special welcome to the members of the Research Network who are joining us today. We'd like to thank all those who've made this event possible, in particular, Dr. Anna Winterbottom, our symposium coordinator, Miles Brown, student project assistant, and Lauren Williams, the Blacker Wood librarian. They'll be watching the chat today, and if you have any problems in viewing the webinar, please send a note in the chat. This webinar is being recorded, and you'll be able to view it and previous webinars on YouTube. We'll be sending a link to all who registered. We'll also be sending periodic updates on the Gwillim Project as we begin work on publications, exhibitions, and additional special events. You can reach us by email, and it's a simple email address, ladygwillim@gmail.com. And Lady Gwillim is all one word, lowercase. ladygwillim@gmail.com. It is my pleasure now to introduce the moderator of this session, Professor A. Srivathsan. Professor Srivathsan is an architect and urban designer and currently the executive director of the Center for Research on Architecture and Urbanism, CEPT University, Ahmedabad. He was previously at Anna University in Chennai. Some of his major research projects include HAMPI, the Indian Digital Heritage Research Project, Re-envisioning the City, and the Megacities Project. His research and writing include the themes of urban history and planning and contemporary architectural practices. Srivathsan has co-edited the recently published book titled The Contemporary Hindu Temple, Fragments for a History, published by Marg. His current work includes a book on Chennai's planning history. Professor Srivathsan will introduce our panelists and will be posing your questions to the speakers at the end of their presentation. Please use the chat function to ask your questions. Thank you for attending, et je vous souhaite bonne conférence. Over to you, Professor Srivathsan.
Thank you, Victoria and Anna, for inviting me to moderate this session on environment, architecture, and climate. A warm welcome to all those who have joined in to listen to the webinar. The letters and paintings of Elizabeth Gwillim and Mary Simons make for a fascinating reading and remain as a valuable source of history. Today, we will hear Professor Vikram Bhatt and Professor Vinita Damodaran speak on the aspects of architecture and environment as gleaned from the letters and paintings. Let me first introduce Professor Vikram Bhatt and invite him to share his views and insights. Professor Vikram Bhatt is a professor of architecture at McGill University, where he teaches courses in urban design and housing. Born and raised in India, Bhatt graduated from the prestigious Ahmedabad School of Architecture Center for Environmental Planning and Technology, that's CEPT University, in 1973. He obtained his Master's of Architecture from McGill University in 1975. He then rejoined the School of Architecture at McGill, where since 1988, he has also led the MCHG activities, focusing attention on the shelter problems of poor. Currently, he is working on the question of food security and urban sustainability, both in North America and abroad, particularly in informal housing in developing countries. In Resorts of the Raj, hill stations of India, he examined these settlements as an idea using archival records, historical accounts, illustrations, and personal observations. Most recently, he is the co-author of a blueprint for ACT. Welcome, Vikram, and over to you.
Thank you, Victoria. Thank you, Dr. Srivathsan, for such a kind introduction. Greetings, scholars. The title of my presentation is Follies, Gopurams, Domes, and Village Waters. I'm trying to look at these elements, architectural and urban elements, and with the help of these, in the paintings of Elizabeth and Mary, I'm trying to place them at Madras in the 19th century. First slide, please. I paint. Here is Mary's sketch of Ascension Island and a couple of sketches I made of the Amalfi Coast. I just have to crack open my little moleskin to transpose myself in time and place. So with the help of Lady Elizabeth Gwillim and Mary Simon's portfolios, I have tried to explore and analyze the built and natural environment of 19th century Madras. Next. As an architect, I cannot help but sketch. Here to the left, you see a series of sketches I made in slums of India. No, they are like a visual narrative. You can see there are women who have gotten together and they are rolling papads, or there are family members all around the place and they are rolling hand-rolled cigarettes and so on. The process is not unlike Elizabeth Small's sketches in her letters, which you see to the right and in the middle top, or in the sketches that Lady Emily Eden, sister of Lord Auckland, did. And they too were written from India, and that one you see in the middle bottom. Consequently, you have to realize that I approach our sister's portfolio not as an art historian, but as an urban designer and an architect. Next. I have also considered maps and charts of the period. In late 1790s, the company established the Survey School of Madras. Maps were strategically important. They were used to establish and run a huge empire. Here is a map of Madras that was made in early 19th, at the end of the 18th century, middle of 18th century, sorry. It shows Madras, including Fort St. George, and it's important to note that at the beginning of the 1700s, the population of Madras was about 100,000. In 1750s, when this map was made, the population had plummeted to about 55,000. And by 1800, when our sisters landed, it was starting to boom again, and population was almost 125,000 people. What's important to note here that how much information can be obtained by looking at such a map. You can see that there is a fleet of the French siege onto the left, and as well as that, you can see the supply ships onto the right, how they must have landed and laid the siege on the shore onto the left side, and then moved further beyond Coombe River and encircled the entire settlement and so on. So by looking at the maps, it gives us historical information, organization of the fleets, it tells us about geography of the place, physical setting, and urban hierarchy, and so on. So I really rely as a designer, urban designer, to a great deal in looking at the maps. One thing I should point out here, I am not following the convention. The north should be up north vertically, but to fit these maps, north is to be read onto the horizontal east-west plane and not vertical north-south plane. So that is not a kind of convention, but please bear with it. And the second thing I'm going to do is also I'm going to use these images and other information and use the old names, Madras, and so on. So please, these are the two considerations we have to realize. Next. Colleagues have considered William Hodge's influence. I consider James Fobb as a worthy candidate of a greater and a detailed look. He was a great draftsman, a fine artist, and a keen observer. Like our sister, he sketched the daily life, wildlife, flora, and architecture of Western India. Here you see to the left an engraving of a banyan tree and a man praying. And to the right, the water tank and the royal compound of the Dabhoi. It's a small princely kingdom in South Gujarat. He manages to capture the important landscape element, water tanks, small islands, pavilions, rich native vegetation. You can count in the smaller paintings on the right, you can count coconut, banana, cactus, banyan, and the daily life, all very beautifully captured, but also in a very artistic but impressionistic way. Fobb's original archives are at the Yale Center for British Art and Rare Books. I hope to consult these archives soon in parallel with that of our sisters. Next. I see likeness in Fobb's and Mary's landscape. See picture 106.12, a banyan tree in a rural setting. Both artists are captivating, also evocative and precise. Describing such a countryside, Elizabeth wrote, the great beauty of this place is that if you quit the seaside, you have always a river on one hand or the other, or else a tank, by which you are to understand a lake, partly natural, but aided by art and dams being carefully kept up. Some of these tanks are many miles long and are very fine pieces of water. Next, please. In 1794, uncle and nephew team of Thomas and William Daniel recorded Madras. Their stay was very brief, but their renderings of the place are precise. This is because they often use large camera obscura. Primarily, they use this device to compose their paintings very quickly. Although the works are considered shaped by their historical convention and their English market's expectation, Thomas wrote that his work is that of a naturalist, a philosopher, or a scientist, exploring the shores of Asia for the diffusion of truth. Until now, their images of Madras endure as geographical markers of the establishment. The context is much altered and eroded, yet important features and locations remain. In this southeast view of the Fort St. George, we see a long beach trading post in the middle of a core of the land that was about 2 miles wide and 5 miles long. In 1639, British East India merchants had negotiated a lease on that. By 1640, this fort was set up. The scene is from around where the French invading forces might have landed their siege. And beyond, we see the site was and remained completely unprotected from the sea until a safe harbor was built in the 19th century. This commercial handicap set back Madras by about 100 years compared to Calcutta and Bombay. Next. And here is Mary's watercolor from about the same vantage point. Notice the similarities. The oversized Union Jack, flotilla of tall ships at bay, local fishers and their crafts on beach in the foreground. The key difference between the two paintings here is The fort appears much closer and built up in her painting. This is because Daniel's images were captured on a large format camera obscura plate, as if via a wide-angle lens, whereas Mary painted her work through normal eyes, equivalent to a 50mm lens. Next. Another time capsule image of Thomas and William Daniels is of the old bridge on the Adyar River. The arch structure is in the front of St. Thomas Mount. Considering St. Thomas' affiliation with the mount, the characters in the foreground, and the color treatment of the engraving, the image, guys, is biblical. This was the first bridge on Adyar River, replaced by Marmalong Bridge. That and the Mount Road plus St. Thomas Mount continue to serve as cardinal points of Madras. Next. Mary painted the grounds of St. Thome House with the bottom, at the bottom right, we see an arched bridge. And the painting is entitled, Seen from the Grounds of St. Thome House, St. Thome Bridge. I could not identify St. Thome Bridge in context of their home in old maps. Noting the number of arches on Mary's Bridge and Daniel's make me wonder, could it be the Armenian Bridge? However, Gwillams were living in St. Thome at some distance from it. So the question remains, which is this bridge? Daniel's image, though, looks as if it was painted in a dry, arid place. I find Mary's portrayal of their homestead is really true to their lush tropical setting and in keeping with the original character of the place. Next. In Thomas and William Daniels' image of western entrance to Fort St. George, to the left near the clump of trees, we see the government house. To the right of the big Union Jack, we see St. Mary's Church. The bridge in foreground led across Coombe River. Originally, governors of Madras lived inside the fortification. It's expensive to build fortification, so it was obvious the city was quite compact. Next, please. This map of Madras, circa 1710, you can see that compact settlement. According to Norma Evanson, Professor Emerita of Architectural History at Berkeley, she writes, while the London merchant confined in narrow terrace house dreamed of the day when he might retire to a country estate, his counterpart in India enjoyed the life of a country gentleman while still engaged in urban commerce. And even under the fear of repeated enemy attacks, the city started to grow outside the fortification. Company agents laid out a garden for the employees, which you just see to the north and right of the river. That was the company garden which was set up. To welcome and entertain dignitaries, a need was expressed for a company garden house and approved by the board. And you guessed it, sooner than the building was completed, governors started using it as their country home. All this was destroyed during the conflict with the French. Next. So when Madras was reverted to the British, an estate of one Mrs. Medeiros, a wealthy merchant widow, was rented as a governor's house, as narrated in Story of Madras by Glyn Barlow. Immediately after moving in, Governor Saunders purchased it, and justifying it, he wrote, it having been always usual for the company to allow the president a house in the country to retire to, and Mrs. Medeiros being willing to dispose her house, it was agreed to buy the house for 500 pagodas. Agreed that it be purchased according to the company's garden house, having been demolished by the French when the possession of the place was in the hands of the French invading forces. Next, please. In 1798, Edward Lord Clive II became governor of Madras. He found that country house too small, got it renovated and enlarged. also asked his friend John Goldingham to design a banquet hall and a meeting hall, which you see here on the right. Goldingham was an astronomer, also worked as an architect and engineer, and he was the head of Madras Service School. This 1708 view includes the government house and council chamber or the banquet hall, about which one of the sisters writes, "One evening at a ball at Lord Clive's, where there are many large glass lanterns, the lightning shooting through the windows upon the cut glass lightened up as they were, with dancers under, produced one of the finest effects I ever saw." Next, please. To situate us better, let us look at the 1823 map of Madras that was prepared by John Goldingham to find velocity of sound. Note the spread of the town between two rivers, Kun and Adyar River. That area is filled with country-like estates. In spite of opposition of the British East India Company's official to the folly and vanity of merchants in having parade of country houses and gardens, any attempt by the Madras Council to restrict land grants to the upper rank of the employees failed. General movement outward proved irreversible. You can see on the Adyar River onto the right, an island. Beyond, as you go north, you will see a little circle. And let's go to the next one. Well before 1800, the city had crossed Adyar River. See Thomas and William Darjan's race ground and the assembly rooms. That is where the round circle I pointed out. The race ground and assembly room were a very popular outpost. St. Thomas Mount, which can be seen in the background, was a favorite place for the British to go take the air in the evenings, and around where sisters had rented a house. Next. To escape the oppressive heat, the Adyar River to the relative high grounds of St. Thomas were the two preferred locations. As well as that, the classically inspired, transparent pavilion-like buildings were also preferred. James Brodie, of which rich, wealthy merchant, had acquired on that island I pointed out, on Kibble Island, on Adyar River, a large tract of land. And on it, he had built his castle, which you see here on the right. With the declining fortunes, however, he had to rent it out, and first tenant was Sir Thomas Strange, the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Madras, whom our colleagues have already introduced. Mary describes the use of pankhawala to stay comfortable in such hot summers. In most of the dining rooms, they have two men stand in the opposite corners of the room with very large fans made in the form of flags. They are much ornamented with paintings and brass. They are made of a sort of grass, which when dampened gives out a very agreeable perfume. These cool the room very much. Generally, it's khas or vetiver grass that is used to make these fans. Next, please. And this is Chief Justice Sir Thomas's own villa, painted by John Young Porter circa 1811. Next. And here is a watercolor painting of the Castellets by John Gantz. Two neo-Gothic castled houses, wedding cake-like, were designed and built and owned by Colonel Thomas Elliot Haviland. He worked for the Madras engineers. He also designed St. Andrew's Kirk. The Castellets were in Pudakkam near Mount Road. Next, please. And here Mary's painting of Mr. Faulkner's villa at Adyar. This one is one more of those follies. Next, please. Or for that matter, their own St. Thome home. Although a single-story structure, they lived in a dramatic and rambling place. Next. Mary made several paintings of it. Tract of land between Adyar and Coombe rivers was covered with such places, interspersed with large estates and gardens. Next, please. Most of the houses had their appendages of servants and animal quarters, as well as cook houses. Mary's picture 106.2 describes this as domestic offices Madras. I think it's a group of such outbuildings. In couple of Elizabeth's painting, one of common era on the left and jungle fowl on the right. Next, please, sorry. What resembles like their St. Thome house and service structures are seen. Additionally, she writes, the trees are large and tall. The whole place is like parks and gardens with every beauty. Next, please. In the 1814 map of Madras, we can see luxuriant spaces between long streets connecting surrounding settlements and villages. Notice the abundance of trees, which are all dot, dot, dot. They do not show the avenues which you could see in Goldingham's map. So the whole place in between the rivers is studded with trees. Furthermore, look at the number of water bodies of varying sizes. Each is married with their own building, even activity like farms and paddy fields. The colonial urban tram and buildings of varying sizes are integrated within the traditional rural carpet. Perhaps observing an flooded paddy field, Elizabeth Road, agriculture is carried out here in a manner just the reverse of yours, and so is gardening. As you raise beds for the vegetables and leave a sunk path to walk around, here they sink the bed around handbreadth. The path round is raised. This is in order to retain the water. And look at in the map how many paddy fields are shown all along each and every water field which is there. Mary captured, next please. Mary captured this enchanted rural landscape that was studded with various religious buildings, and each one of them had their own architectural character. Here is a beautiful painted mosque, picture 106.9. However, it's entitled Entrance to a Hindu Temple. I am sure it's a Muslim religious structure. Look at the minarets, treatment of onion domes, and so on. Next, please. Next picture, 106.2, palm near sacred buildings is of Muslim burial ground. Mix of memorials and decorated shrine could belong to a wealthy merchant or a noble family. Historical maps show different burial grounds all around Madras, Armenian, British, Catholic, primarily for Portuguese and the French, for the Muslims, and so on. Next, please. And of course, in picture 106.31, pagodas, Mary painted a Hindu temple complex. The sacred water tank is marked by ceremonial pavilions. The flight of steps gradually lead down to the water. We can just imagine. A tall wall protects the lower temple complex. A Gopuram is to the right, and the main temple shrine, the Vimanam, is in the middle. The other rising pair of Gopurams crown the upper temple complex. Mary did not paint many Gopurams. However, we will encounter a few in Elizabeth's work. Next. Water is ever present in Mary's paintings. You can see a number of paintings here. Next, please. Water is also well covered in the works of other artists. Here, how Justinian Grant saw Adia River from the terrace of a British bungalow. Next, please. And look at the wetlands in two of Mary's paintings, 106.43 and 44. Apparently, both depict the same water body. Though in the painting on the left of Brahmin women with a lota, it serves as a background, whereas in the main, it's the main subject on the right. Next, please. Sabu and Stephanie Master's classification of Elizabeth birds in three groups: birds and details, birds with partial background, and birds with full background is also a good frame to consider the landscape in works of Elizabeth. Next. In full background bird painting, Elizabeth combines her landscape painting skills learned under George Samuel with what she observed in the works of two ornithologists, Mark Catesby and Thomas Berry. Here, the chestnut bittern and the marsh grasses seem to artificially have been dropped on top of a sweeping riverscape and distant mountain scenery. Next, the things improve as we move along in her works. She improves the technique here. If we look at the crested wood partridge, you can imagine airbrushing out the partridge. We can imagine beautiful watercolor landscape, the countryside with fields, water and some structures hidden in the grove of trees on the right, with the faint chill out of a mountain range in distance under the light mauve orange glow of the dusk. Next. I have cropped the image of black-winged stilt to illustrate this. With the big body of the stilt gone, our attention is now drawn to the crowning pair of Gopuram, right in the center at the distance, next, left to the left of the two legs. Next. The landscapes are often populated with human activities. Here behind the white thrush under the jungle foliage, some ruins, and at a distance, a soaring Gopuram, once again. Next, please. Both the yellow wattle lapwing and the landscape of Muslim shrine with minarets are painted with the lightest brushstroke and watercolor washes. Next. And here, a flock of small egret who thrive on shallow waters have invaded the watercolor of a village situated in the foothills on the far shores of the lake with its rising Gopuram. Describing such scenery, Elizabeth wrote, "The pagodas rise among the trees and are shaded till you come near them. The fresh verdure, the constant show of blossoms, the groups of people with their light, graceful dresses and overall bright clearness of the sky gives the whole place an air of cheerfulness that I have never seen equaled." Next, please. With a light touch, the artist details the countryside with a cow herd and his animals. A couple of villagers are seen walking. At a distance, a grove of palm trees, a pair of Gopurams on the horizon, a timeless portrayal of traditional India. On the foreshore, a lifelike painting of a wagtail. Next, please. Placed side by side are two of Elizabeth's paintings, Whisker Tren and to the left and Gull on the right. Together, their background covers the entire countryside from the seashore to the hills and the lands in between. Her landscapes include a tall ship, coastal vegetation of palm trees, clumps of thick tropical foliage, some architectural ruins, a lake, perhaps a river, and distant hills. Next, please. And finally, we have a pair of male and female quail on a branch of a neem tree. What an evocative pair with a dragonfly hovering above. Beyond lies the open sea, the Bay of Bengal, with the coastal scenery in between, including a dome in there. As if she is longing to hear back from home via the tall ship at bay. Next, please. In conjunction with crisscrossing rivers and rivulets, great lakes and small water reservoirs, what I call village waters, an intricate network of native settlements thrived on the coast. Notice the number of water bodies which were surveyed with every town which is noted or a village noted there in a map of 1794 entitled the Jagir lands of the coast of Coromandel. Majority of these waters have now been covered over, filled in, and have disappeared. Without their biannual recharge, water shortages happen frequently. Next, please. The situation is not too different from what we did here on the island of Montreal. The island was traversed by natural stream. All the streams in yellow are now filled over. With the profound negative climatic implication, water is not retained on the island anymore, rushes to the main river, contributing to coastal flooding with the increasing rains. Next, please. The green Madras, known for its profuse and rich vegetation, is also endangered. And this has happened in last 20 years. Look at the tree cover, which is on this year 2000 compared to 2017. Next, please. In the Mysore painted by Mary, not the same time, look at the vegetation of the time. To sum up our sister's work, I would like to read a part of Lawan, the Rudyard Kipling used to conclude his 7 C's. When the earth last painting is painted and the tubes are twisted and dried, when oldest colors have faded and the youngest critic has died, we shall rest, and faith we shall need it. Lie down for an eon or two, till the master of all good workmen shall put us to work anew. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Mary, for recording all this for the subsequent generations, for us to cherish and learn from. Back to you.
Thank you, Vikram. Let me now introduce Professor Vinita Damodaran. Professor Vinita Damodaran is a historian of modern India, interested in sustainable development dialogues in the global south. Her work ranges from the social and political history of Bihar to the environmental history of South Asia, including using historical records to understand climate change in the Indian Ocean world. An experienced researcher and teacher, she has an MPhil from JNU Delhi and a PhD from Cambridge. She is the director of the Center for World Environmental History at Sussex and is also the author of several articles in established journals. Welcome, Vinita, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Srivathsan. And I'll move without much ado to my presentation and share my screen. So what I'll be talking about today, I hope everyone can see that. Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this amazing network. I was thrilled to look at the drawings and the paintings and read the correspondence of the sisters, the Gwillim, Elizabeth Gwillim and Mary Simmons in Madras at the turn of the 18th century. As you know, I'm an environmental historian with expertise mainly on Eastern India. So looking at Madras for this particular paper was extremely rewarding for me. So that, of course, painting, as we've just learned from the very erudite presentation of that just went before me, is Mysore is not Madras, from the sisters' painting. Sorry, I'm trying to move on. Stuck. Sorry, I am trying to move this on. There is a problem. Okay, yeah, sorry. Okay, the themes of the presentation today, sorry, my presentation was a bit stuck, is the context of the correspondence of Elizabeth Gwillim, who, as we've learned, is the wife of the Chief Justice of Madras, Henry Gwillim, and her sister Mary Simmons. And the date of the correspondence is very important for us, 1801 to 1806. So the paintings, of course, and the correspondence is very rich in terms of the descriptions of the landscape and the environment of Madras. But what I'm interested here, and I'll be focusing on here, is their descriptions of the weather and the monsoon in particular. And I'll talk a little bit about the context of the correspondence, which is the wars. You've had the Anglo-Mysore wars, the Maratha wars, and in the context of that, the floods, the droughts, and the scarcities that went side by side. And finally, I'll end with what they end with in the correspondence, which is the Vellore Mutiny. So what do we know about Madras and its surroundings? This is, of course, not a painting by the sisters. It's a John Gans painting, and you've heard about John Gans briefly in the last presentation. And what we know about the establishment of Madras is, of course, it was by 1522, it was a Portuguese foothold, and they established Santhome, some 4 to 5 kilometers south of the present Chennai city center. And the current location of Madras grew from the fort and trading port founded in 1639, following negotiations between Francis Day and Andrew Cogan of the East India Company and the local Hindu Raja. The fort or factory, initially known as Fort St. George or Madrasapatnam, the White Town, had been designed as an administrative center controlled by the governor, and by 1688 to 1749 had gradually begun administering the region in a radius of 5 miles round it. And we've heard from the last presentation how the population had changed from being about 50,000, it had collapsed, and then it came back to being about 125,000 when the sisters are there, or when the sisters arrive. This is, of course, a painting, again, as we heard last time, a Daniel's painting of a distant view of the Black Town, it's called. And the Black Town is very interesting. After the establishment of the company's factory in Madras, weavers and merchants were attracted from many other South Indian centers and settled along the north of Fort St. George in what became known as the Black Town, as opposed to the White Town of the fort. I believe this is not because of racial implications, because we have to be quite careful about how we ascribe this at that time. It's more to do with the way in which they were allowed to paint, and this might be subject to some discussion later on, how the European quarters painted their fortifications in terms of how the Black Town sort of develops. So the area was renamed Georgetown after the visit of George V, and the large dome building is the Armenian Church of 1772, and to the left, the minarets of the mosque built by Muhammad Ali, the Nawab of Carnatic. So some of the representations that we see here this is another painting not by the sisters, is by Charles Curtis, and the representations here are slightly different from the representations that we've heard in the last presentation. And here is Charles Curtis, a surgeon of the EIC in 1782-83, talking about the countryside, where he said the country around was more than overrun and plundered by the horse troops of Hyder Ali. So that, and here he talks about the vegetables and fruits was by far too scanty, and a few imperfectly cultivated and unripened fruits with a coconut juice or called toddy was all we could procure for our scorbutics. Another source of unhealthiness arises from the situation of the town and fort of Madras itself, built upon a low, flat and sandy beach and surrounded almost entirely by stagnant swamps or ponds of stagnant water, which are not only a receptacle for every sort of corruption and filth, but have their edges as well as the beach on the other side, covered at all hours of the day with natives in the act of relieving nature from their burdens, to take advantage of the water for washing afterwards, which is their invariable custom. What a source of putrid exhalations under a vertical sun. So here is Charles Curtin's representation, which is very different from the representation of the sisters. But he also talks a lot about, of course, here, about the impact of the war and the plundering, both here, of course, he's ascribing it to Hyder Ali. So what do we get from some of these representations? That the countryside was recovering from war with Tipu, who was finally defeated in 1799. The Fourth Anglo-Mysore War resulted in the overthrow of the House of Hyder Ali and the dismantlement of Mysore to the benefit of the East India Company, which took control of much of the Indian subcontinent. We've heard a little bit about Edward Clive, the last presentation, who was the governor of Madras and who bore the responsibility for the defeat and death of Tipu. The ruler of the Indian state of Mysore, referred to, and he was referred to very often in the sisters' letters. In fact, the farewell party given to Clive is mentioned in terms of the visitation by a storm. The East India Company's territorial acquisitions at this time, of course, drained vast sums from its coffers, but individuals are still making immense profits. The payoff for the Battle of Plassey was over £1 million, of which Clive received £31,000 himself. And all through the period, we can see that revenue stress, as the company gains control over Madras and over the rest of India, revenue collection intensified the agrarian stress and the famines of the period. exacerbated with the famines in the latter half of the 18th century, which saw a series of scarcities, 1733, 1782, 83, 1785, 1782, 83, which affected South India, including Madras city and the surrounding areas, and extended to Mysore. And so, some of the data on the famines of the latter half of this period calculates about 11 million people having died in the famines. This was the time, 1801, when they arrived. So you get a very, very different description of the city and its environments, and we've heard some of this, about how the countryside is truly beautiful in the letters here of Mary Simmons, October 14th, 1801, soon after they arrived. I think this is the most beautiful country here, a variety of fine trees, delightful verdure. We drive out every morning from 5 to 7, at which time it's quite fresh and cool here, and the greatest variety of roads that can be made in a flat country, and which everyone takes us, is sure of a fine avenue or a beautiful lane, shaded by the bamboo intermixed with a gum Arabic tree which abounds here, and is the most elegant tree I ever saw. The largest trees that resemble English foliage are the tulip tree, the banyan, and the mango. These, I mean, are common in the public roads, but we have a great number, very fine, in the gardens. This tree, of course, is not any of those. It's a breadfruit tree. But and this is, of course, comes from one of their paintings. But in many ways, they are depicting the flora, the fauna, the trees and the plants of this 5-mile radius that they sort of inhabit, in terms of the garden houses, which were so beautifully depicted by Vikram in the last presentation. And here again is a view of the Hindu village, which they talk about. The villages are more concealed. They are, for the most part, in the groves of cocoa palms, in the neighborhood of some chowdhury or pagoda, both of which are very numerous. They consist of a set of houses made little other than larger beehives of palm leaves, plated and attached with the same, or with palmyra leaves, another kind of palm. These villages have their thousands. The pagodas are places of worship of Gentoo, and the chhatris are for the reception of travelers. Choltris are for the reception of travelers and built by them. The mosques are, as you know, the Mormons' place of worship. This is E.G. in 1801, depicting the Hindu village. And here's another description of the pagodas, which rise among the trees that are shaded till you come near them. The chow trees are low buildings, mere porticos with only sometimes apartments at the back. They are rich. They're of stone and richly ornamented with carved work, but the exuberance of foliage conceals all but the front. This gives them an air of solemnity. That is a beautiful contrast to the general gaiety of the country, the fresh verdure, the constant show of blossoms, the groups of people with their light, graceful dresses, and overall the bright clearness of the sky gives the whole place an air of cheerfulness that I've never seen equaled. And this we've already heard from Vikram. So the representation is of rice fields and mimosa. The enclosure of rice cornfields are very irregular, some small, and others like common shrubs in England with groves and plantations of tall trees and flowering shrubs of every form, various than you can guess from the great leaf, the cocoa palm, each one of which is a load for a strong man, which he binds up and carries on his head or shoulder like a dead plank, to the fine cut mimosas, of many of which are as light and thin as a piece of lace. These groves and corners, the full hedges, give a remarkable richness to the look of the cornfields. Never were seen such beautiful hedgerows as are on each side, the roads, and dividing every field and garden. That's Elspeth Gwillim in 1802. So the depiction of houses, of verdant rice fields, and then of the river edge, here, which Vikram also talked about. We have 4 rivers in this place, none of them navigable within some miles of this place. They're only for boats. They are very shallow streams, but broad when there has been rain. The banks rich with wood in many parts. I won't quote the whole thing, but just because Vikram has already quoted it for you. But they really do tell us about the waterways and the aquifers and the ways in which the great beauty of the place is. And this is, of course, the view from Faulkner's Place, about the ways in which the river's edge was built by these, well, it had these garden houses from which you could enjoy the scenery. So there's a lot on rivers, tanks, and aquifers, and I think this would be very useful. This is very useful for any environmental historian of India. Agriculture is carried on here in matter just the reverse of yours, and so is gardening. For as you raise the bed for the vegetables and leave a sun path to run around them, they sink the bed about a handbreadth and the path around is raised. This is in order to retain the water, which is of course much exhausted in the day. And you saw that map which Vikram showed us of the paddy fields. So the rice is green in, and the fields and flowers keep blowing on us. They do not depend immediately on the rains for the preservation of things of that kind. The tanks and rivers do not fail, and they cut channels in every direction, which they easily fill, and water every part. That's Edie in 1801. So the natural history observations complement the observations of the sisters, where Betsy has been, as you know, this is from Mary, Betsy has been very busy employed by drawing birds. The village people have been very good in bringing many curious ones to her. And going on to the latter last three sentences, we are here surrounded by hills and lakes. The neighboring villages and the chow trees are situated in beautiful groves for wherever the natives of this country build. They also plant, every man makes a screen for his own house to shelter him from the bad wind and to shade him from the noonday sun. So this is a landscape clearly that has been really built in many ways. The greenness of this landscape is part and parcel of the way in which the environmental history of this area is a tribute to the way in which the local communities and of course planted trees and so on. So this is not a natural landscape, as we can see. This is very much a landscape that was intervened in and as a result of a lot of tree planting by local communities. The sisters also talked a lot about the seasons and the vegetables, and the warm weather seemed to agree with me very well. It's now getting as warm as is agreeable. We had a few fine showers a day or two ago, but we are not to expect rain till June. And it'll be hotter till that time. The last 3 months have been the most delightful weather that can be imagined. I begin to get a housekeeper to feel at home. At first, I did not know how to order the dinner. However, I found now that seasons are only considered in vegetables. And in very few of those, most of the fruit trees bear blossom and fruits at the same time. The plantains of all kinds are always growing. Melons are not quite in yet. The favorite fruit of the country is the mango, and the mango trees are now in full bloom, smelling very fresh and nice. The orchards look like walnuts or pear trees, but the flowers a large spike of small blossoms, meadow sweet. There are as many sort of mangoes as of apples and much difference in them. That's E.G. in 1802. So when they record the weather, and this is where I want to focus a little bit, one needs to know that the climate of Madras was largely governed by the large-scale seasonal wind associated with the Southeast Asian or Indian monsoon system. But it is significantly modified by the East Coast position of Madras adjacent to the Bay of Bengal. So summarizing the main features of the climate in Madras, you have the 4 seasons: a cool, dry season with the northeast winds from mid-December to mid-February, a hot, dry season with the southeast and later southwest winds from mid-February to May, the southwest monsoon rainy season from June to October, and a northeast monsoon rainy season from October to mid-December. So the upper easterlies prevailing both the southwest and the northeast monsoon rainy seasons, but are replaced by upper westerlies in the dry season. It's interesting that many of the cyclones that hit that coast, and most recently there was a cyclone which was just passed yesterday or last week, was in the season of the northeast monsoon rainy season from October to mid-December, though the sisters don't seem to record any cyclone, though they were all through the 18th century and the early part of the 19th century, and we are trying to build a cyclonic record for the period. There were on average cyclones about 5 or 6 that hit the region. And how do we know about this? Because the Madras Meteorological Society set up its observation point, and Madras was one of the earliest sites for recording meteorological observations, and it was seen as an optimal location for the reconstruction of a long continuous series of monthly climatic measurements in India, which was the Madras Meteorological Observatory was established in 1786. And some of the people who inhabited and collected data from the mid-1700s, and Glaser, there's a very interesting article by Glaser about these, and he's recorded the weather diaries of missionaries in 1732, 1737, 1789, and 91. And they talk about both, and they give you quite detailed daily and sub-daily pressure and temperature readings. And this is quite useful for us when we are mapping the climate and weather in the 18th and 19th century. And William Roxburgh, of course, is the most well-known of these. He was assistant surgeon and the Controller General of the Army and Fortification Accounts on the Coromandel Coast. James Capper were making daily meteorological measurements, including barometric pressure in Madras at this time. And Roxburgh's measurements cover the period October 1776 to May 1778, after which he went off to the Botanic Gardens in Calcutta. And these readings, again, are very useful for us to understand the climate and weather in the region. And when you map and correlate the collection of this information, the monthly mean sea level pressure data, MSLP record, and correlate it with El Nino, the warming of the ocean, the southern oscillation phenomenon, and all India rainfall, you can get quite a detailed evidence of the climate in this time. And in general, the Madras MSLP record is shown to be robust over time. And people like Rob Allen and Glaser have collected the data from these observations and diaries of the 18th century Madras travelers, and they've seen it as quite useful in terms of understanding the ENSO phenomenon and its interaction with the Indian monsoon and the Indian Ocean dipole. And I think it's very, very important to harvest this material in order to have an understanding of the climate and the changes in the climate in this time. And one thing that's quite important that we found from these meteorological observations was the devastating El Nino of 1783 to 93, which Richard Grove has talked about quite extensively in his book, Ecology, Climate and Empire. So for the Gwillim sisters, they were encountering the calm after the storm. India had been in the grips of the most devastating El Nino from 1783 to 1793, which had killed an estimated 600,000 people in Madras presidency. And the unsettled weather brought with it typhoons, storms in the first instance, and later droughts and famine. And you can see this in later writings, of course, by George Campbell, published in 1868, which gives a detail of the famine around Madras in 1782, which he says was primarily driven by both climate, but he also cites the warfare when the enemy was at their walls by his ravage in every part of the adjacent country. Cattle were destroyed, reducing the inhabitants the most pressing difficulty to obtain the common necessities of life. The death of 600,000 people is recorded in the region, including the northern Sirkars, which is the region, the Godavari Delta, north of Madras. The other thing that's recorded in this period are typhoons. In 1787, there was a big typhoon. William Roxburgh noted a major loss of his papers, including those of various plant species in this collection. It's quite interesting, this whole period of unsettled events between 1785 to about 1795, 10 years, this seemed to be part of a El Nino, La Nina sort of event in the subcontinent, which caused one of the most serious droughts in the period. It's quite interesting to see whether the EIC stops exactions. Lord Cornwallis was suspicious of false claims, claiming that it will be the duty of the Board of Revenue to make scrupulous investigations and to reject every ill-founded claim for deductions. They also interfere with the market. But the revenue accession, in fact, intensified and continued nonetheless. It's very important to note that all through the 18th century in Madras, productivity of land declined astronomically. So, where you get very high yields at the start of the century, by the end of the century, the yields have really collapsed. And it's quite important for us as environmental historians to find out why this was happening in terms of both revenue exactions, the exhaustion of the soil, climate, and so on. The scale of the mortality is in Roxburgh's views and his writings. Already devastated by the famine in 1780s, the Sarkars of Madras were badly affected by the droughts in 1789 to 92. And if you look at the rainfall levels, Buchanan had also noted that since 1782, rainfall levels had deteriorated. The drought ended in 1792, be followed by another period of drought, 1802, 1804, which seems to have extended. It's interesting that the sisters note the lack of rainfall in the period 1801 to 1803 in their letters. And the impact you can get from some secondary sources like this thing by B.S. Chandrababu, which talks about agriculture in the district of Chingalput, where quite close to Madras, where rainfall averaged about 45 inches during the year, and how dependent it was on the monsoon. And when there was a failure of the monsoon, here he talks about rainfall sufficient for cultivation usually was not available in April and May. During the southwest monsoon, June to September, the early dry crops were grown. However, much of the cultivation was carried out with the northeast rains, which was supposed to fill the tanks and enable the wet or irrigated crops to be raised. And I think it'll be very interesting to look at the paintings to see when they're talking about verdant rice fields, which are the periods to map it to these agricultural cycles, which you can get from some of the other literature. But of course, when the sisters are talking about scarcity in the period 1801 to 1803 and the worry about it's very different from who is affected by these scarcities. Of course, at this time, the weavers are still in employment. The famines after the 1830s and 1840s really do affect the famines, really do affect the weavers. Remember that the weaving community still was still at this time gainfully employed, and you had to wait for the emergence of mill-made cloth for the weavers to be completely devastated by the bringing in of British mill-made cloth. So here's Elizabeth Gwillim's specific sort of comments about the monsoon. Here she's writing it to her mother. The months of November, December, January are what is called here the monsoon, that is the rainy season. The surf of the sea is very great to this coast, and therefore during this period it's thought unsafe for any vessels to lie near the coast. The commencement of the monsoon, the flag is struck and not set up again till it's over, so there are no ships moving, clearly, as great numbers of vessels of different sorts are constantly lying here at other times. This circumstance of itself gives the natives and settlers a melancholy idea. Indeed, it produces a great change in the appearance of the beach, which generally presents a most lively and busy scene. The country ships, that's the coasting vessels, have begun to come in. With a few ships of war, we have near 100, but these make but little show. When we came, roads were crowded with ships of a large size, and we expect every day to see them again in the same state for 9 months of the year. Frequent opportunities will occur of writing. So when the ships are not there during the monsoon season, they can't send their letters. So therefore, there's these breaks in the letters that they get due to the monsoon. And here they also talk a lot about land winds. Both the sisters talk about these winds. When we first landed on the 26th of July, we had land winds with sea breezes in the evening, but it was thought late for the land winds to continue. The natives count the season of the land winds a healthy time. I believe it may be so to all people who are careful and patient. They prevail in April, May, June, and July. The wind is a strong breeze. And in the degree we had then, very pleasant to me at first, but we soon found the effects they are said to produce, sometimes the one and sometimes the other. They give sometimes a dryness of the skin, as if the sand had been blowing on it. I found it impossible to keep my hair from curling to a perfect frizz. And then again in 1802, here she's complaining about boils due to the heat. Mr. Gwillim was really very ill with his for 5 weeks, took up all my attention. They're extremely painful boils. I had 3 would make me ill for many days. The last 6 weeks have been the hottest weather we've had, as it was when we arrived. The land winds have prevailed, which are very disagreeable if they continue all day, but have nothing painful in them except by drying up the skin. The check perspiration brings boils, and prickly heat, which is exceedingly teasing. We have no mosquitoes in this house. Again, 1802 in August. Here she's talking about the 2 months we've been taught to dread, April and May. It turned out to be in this situation the pleasantest I've felt. We had almost constantly a sea breeze. The wind has in it nothing unwholesome, but by blowing over a long space of land heated by the sun. And here again in the second quote, she talks about the extremes of heat and cold seem to produce nearly the same effects as the extremes in England. The wind sweeps with great violence and is dangerous for this reason, and the heat and sharpness of it produces boils and prickly heat, which if exposed to the wind are checked by it. And here, Mary Simmons in 1803, this is the first monsoon day we've had. It now blows hard from the north and rains torrents. We're all praying for a heavy monsoon as the late dry season occasioned a scarcity of rice in some parts, which is a dreadful thing in this country, as the natives depend entirely upon it for their subsistence. In Bengali, they seem to entertain some apprehension as Lord Wellesley has issued an order that no grain of any description shall be exported from there. I suppose that'll come a little hard upon us, for we receive the greatest part of our wheat from thence. So here is again a proclamation that the markets are going to be restricted, rather similar to what Lord Cornwallis did some decades previously. And here is Elizabeth Gwillim's statement that there was no rain during the 17 months of the time. I quote, I've been in India, that is from the end of November 1801 till about April 1803, we saw only 10 hard days of monsoon rain and one shower in the intervening spring. That was to me the pleasantest year we've had. So though there was no rain, she talks about it being very pleasant. So while in the earlier we saw that there was a sense in which there was by Mary that scarcity was at risk. I mean, that they risk scarcity and the natives risk scarcity. So it's quite interesting to use this as a diary for understanding climate and understanding the monsoonal events of the time, and similar to the way in which the diaries of missionaries were used in the 1730s and 1740s to map the climate of Madras at that point. But anyway, here is another quote. The natives are much pleased with the season, for it's a season of plenty. The rain is their wealth and glory. So this is after the rain had fallen in 1803. If we had not had such rains, there would have probably been a famine, a dreadful calamity everywhere. But to these poor people who made no provision for the morrow, horrid beyond description. This is Mary, of course. All the parts about this place, however dry in appearance, which have been barren ever since I came here, were sowed with rice and different grains. The whole place looked like a corn country in England in June. They sowed in December, and now is the harvest. I suppose the greatest part will be cleared in a week, and the tanks, that is reservoirs or lakes, you may call them, are still well stored, and they will no doubt get a second crop. Their custom is to float the fields of rice, by which means the air is impregnated with damps and becomes to me very injurious. And there are also some sayings in the letters. This is Elizabeth quoting a Brahmin saying, if there is no rain by the 15th of October, a long season of dry weather is to be expected. So in many ways, I think the sisters' letters are important for us because they do link up with some of the work being done on collecting weather diaries and reports on the climate conditions. But they also, if you contextualize them, and this is what I wanted to say, what it does tell us, I think, and we need to read these letters, not just what is said in the letters, but what is unsaid. In many ways, the unsettled conditions of the period, they were just coming out of a very, very unsettled condition. The precariousness of British rule in the period, the agricultural decline, the increasing poverty and the famines underlie the letters and needs to be brought to the fore, I think, in the project. The correspondence, of course, ends on a somber note with news and descriptions of the Vellore Mutiny on 10 July 1806, which was the first instance of the large-scale violent mutiny by Indian sepoys of the East India Company, predating the Indian Rebellion of 1857 by half a century. The revolt, which took place in the South Indian city of Vellore, lasted one full day, during which the mutineers seized the Vellore fort and killed or wounded 200 British troops. So I think the underlying darkness of what was happening is also something that we as historians need to think about, that underlie the correspondence. And I'll stop sharing that.
Thank you, Vinita. Just heard two engaging presentations. Before I invite questions and comments, let me briefly respond to the papers. First, let me share a few quick words about the Madras at the time the sisters arrived. This, I hope, will further contextualize and appreciate the presentations better. Madras in the 1800s, when Elizabeth Mary Henry arrived, was a significant period in the city's 380-year history. By the beginning of the 19th century, the British had established their military supremacy, defeated the French and the Mysore kings. Internal fights between Madras council, governor, and the military commander had gone past. These more or less prevailed. More importantly, from a city perspective, the city and its suburbs were beginning to regain their importance. More Europeans had come to Madras to manage the recent territories acquired, and more soldiers were at the city base after the wars. In fact, it was in 1798, the city limits were delimited for the first time for implementing new legal reforms that brought entry to Madras. As Susan Basu's insightful work in Madras at this time would recall, it was the first time the city was formally perceived as a city. And when they did delimit the city or draw the delineation of the city boundary, they were forced to include the home gardens where villas were located under pressure. The Gwillims arrived at this relatively stable environment. The Europeans had moved out of the Fort St. George, the core, to the suburbs. What's more important is changes in land survey and property laws enabled subdivision and sale of land, agricultural land particularly, that supported the creation of what was called home gardens. Large parcels of land with sprawling houses and gardens were built. Current neighborhoods of Madras or Chennai, as it's now known, such as Poyas Garden, Wallace Garden, etc., evidence this form of urban development. The paintings and correspondence of Elizabeth and Mary are views of the city and its life from the comfort of suburbs. All the three homes where the sisters lived, St. Thomas Mount, and Pummel, were far removed from the city. The luxurious life of the English, the large colonial houses, gardening, and retinue of servants and social life are richly described from this lens. Though the three lived among the European elites of the place, Elizabeth in particular had empathy and eye for many local things. Her letters talk about caste hierarchies, functions and festivals, houses of the locals, and particularly interesting to me was a fascination for the use of lime in construction and the real estate boom and the desperation of landlords to retain well-paying tenants. While Elizabeth focused on birds and alluded to city scenes in the background, Mary painted the cityscape as seen from the periphery. The paintings include the famed Tirunirmalai Temple, the Muslim tombs in Mylapore, the cantonment in St. Thomas Mount, the countries in St. Pummel. These were the quick things I could identify from a painting. I'm sure there are a few more to be discovered. Professor Vikram and Vinita teased out some of these interesting details and connected them with the larger practices and histories. They added value and information. Vikram connected the paintings with the other company painters of his time, while Professor Vinita talked about the weather, seasons, famine, a whole range of things that's associated with the landscape and the geographical location of Madras. Now, three quick observations and questions for Vikram. I also had read Vikram's paper, so some of my comments are coming from that as well. Professor Vikram compares the sisters' painting with other painters, which was really helpful. But he categorizes sisters as hobby painters, and that grabbed my attention. If you look at the paintings, they are no less detailed, carefully drawn looking at a real specimen and placed in context. More importantly, they were trained and a clear intent of documenting. Maybe they accompanied Henry Gwillim as wife and sister and not traveled as professional painters. They did not make a big deal or sell the painting or publish it as Hodges and Daniels did. But would that make these sisters hobby painters? That would be my question to Vikram. My second point is about Vikram's description of the large 18th and 19th century colonial houses in Madras as follows. I would like him to be sort of dwell more on this and probably compare them with the emergence of new forms of architecture that came towards the end of the 19th century, which was known widely as Indo-Saracenic. As Elizabeth describes, that there was a proliferation of such large colonial villas, very European in its outlook. Vikram too points out to what he calls a parade of country houses and gardens. It looks Madras of Gwillim's times was yet to discover the Indo-Saracenic style, which became a reigning style for the next 100 years. Madras still was what Metcalfe and Nilsson would call the projection of Greece and Rome, and sought the impressiveness of the whole. So there is a clear period before which hybrid and new forms of architecture had emerged here. My last comment is on Vikram's descriptions of Mary's painting as belonging to a rural setting. Actually, as I was looking, I was imagining it as the suburbs of Chennai. Maybe I was reading and linking it to Madras of their times with my contemporary imagination of the city. Maybe Vikram is right, there was no such thing as suburbs in the 19th century city. The terms town and mafisal, that's the city and country, lend some weight to this. Probably it will be worthwhile to dwell a little bit more about the imagination of town and country in the 19th century Madras. And the usage of the term suburbs, as some have said, I've got an axiomatic grip on the planners. And it's only new terms like peri-urban are coming into city planning. My last observations on Vikram's question about the bridge. You raised whether it's a Mont Blanc bridge or is it some other bridge. Probably it was the Mont Blanc bridge because the sisters lived in St. Thomas Mount as much as they lived in Saint Thome. So probably they were closer to Mont Blanc bridge. However, like you, I'm also now curious and would like to look at the paintings closer. Quickly to Vinita's presentation, which had some fascinating details about the weather, the storm, rains, and famine and agriculture practices. My observation was that right from the inception of Madras, there was a complaint about the choice of the site. And you yourself had mentioned that the land was flat. And the sisters' correspondence also mentioned about that. I'd like your views as an environmental historian, whether the colonial cities actually inverted the port and hinterland relationship of the pre-modern period. For instance, I'm just, as you talked, as you presented, I was just comparing Mahabalipuram, the Pallava port just south of Madras, with its inter-capital city, which was Kanchipuram, which was more than 50 kilometers interlands. So there were port towns in the pre-modern period, but probably they were not as vulnerable as the port towns of the colonial period. Second, in terms of, it's very fascinating when you detail those, the hardships, the extracting revenues and the decline in cultivation. But we don't seem to get a sense of it in the sisters' painting. They all appear lush and necessarily cultivated. Maybe they were literally outside our view because they were living in the landscape that was sort of controlled, and it was outside the tax extraction as a home gardens. So they were probably, though it appears natural, probably they were painting something which was less natural. The last question, I was just wondering of the different plants and species the Elspeth brought in, seeds and so on, how many of them would survive and how many of them were a little more invasive. I'll stop here and invite both of you to respond, and after that we can take questions. Vikram, do you want to go first?
Yeah, you have asked several questions and very pointed ones. I may not remember all of them, but I will try to address a few of them at least in a kind of global way. You raise a very important point about how do we define urbanity? What are cities? What are suburbs? What are the spaces in between? And particularly in contexts like the early 19th century or 18th century Madras, you do have a traditional network of settlements all around there. So this interaction is very important. In one of the letters, Mary notes, I think it's Mary, she says, in 7 mile by 7 mile area, there are about 1 million people living. She doesn't have a census count, but certainly she sees people all the time and the native settlements and how they come out and what is going on and so on. Even if she is halfway there, in 1800, population of London, which was the biggest city on the planet at that time, was 1 million people. I don't have the geographical extent of it. So what we have is a network of traditional small villages, as Gandhi would say. It's a country of villages. And this is where the trade is taking place also, which is the reason the trading post is established. It's an inexpensive kind of cotton that is produced around here. And that's why Madras becomes a very attractive place for trade, for the trading company, as well as representatives who are there and who are busy making money left, right, and center. So this, I think, and there is no cotton as such in Europe at that moment in time. There is no textile industry. You just have linen. So what you have is a very special kind of urbanity, which is informed by the climate, as Vinita described it. And so even until recently, we in the urban thinking always thought suburbs as something separate from the city. But I see a continuity. So that is one answer. The other thing which you touched on in your description, which is very important, from day one, the traders had an ambition. Madras, even if it is not established as a municipality, they're already calling it the presidency. They're looking at it as if this is going to be the place. This is before the War of Plassey in mid-1700s or 1790s, wars of Mysore and others which followed under Wesley, and the empire does get established. So there is this idea that this is going to be a great beach hall. So that is how, what should be the city to be made? What is the image of the city? Norma Evanson comments it very specially. She says the colonial Europeans who came, those who were not colonizers, but the traders or others, they were speculative sojourners. To build a city requires investment in the future. That's how you build a city. So what they were interested in was investing in themselves, and if they could survive, make a fortune. And for them, the fortune lay back home, not unless you were a lower level individual, but then you were a soldier, and then you had no power as such in the power structure. So how do you define the urban decision makers? So this is, I think, a very complex, but it's a very interesting area to look at. This plays out extremely well in the definition of New Delhi. How New Delhi is established vis-a-vis the traditional city of Shah Jahanabad, by the colonial rulers at the beginning of the 20th century. So that is one thing I could say is very worthwhile following. And how do we want to define cities of today in the decision making? And this is what I had asked Subbu to look at. I said, why don't we go look at places like Fort St. David just now and the ruins around there, but you go beyond what are the existing settlements of kind of small and medium-sized towns and villages. Madras may be beyond salvation. The challenges are just unsurmountable, and it has an ambition. But the decisions which we are making in context of other smaller and medium-sized towns and village networks which are around, that's where I think this project can inform us in a very special way in making decision and guiding us in planning and urban design guides that we want to lay out. About the paintings, I'm perhaps a bit overly romantic. I paint, as I say, and I try to read in the paintings as much as I can. So certainly I may be getting a bit soapy, I admit. Nevertheless, just to kind of challenge this, for 200 years, works of these sisters were not known. I looked at it around 1990s, Elizabeth's portfolios, and I was just coming back to it because I was busy doing other things and now I had time. And then the whole team came together. But that's why I call them hobby painters. All the women artists of 18th and especially 19th century Europe are very undervalued to play music and to paint and to be interested in ornithology and biology and botany was very special way of being a lady. So this was part of your education and training. So perhaps they had no ambition. So because Victoria and others have framed this project as women, how they looked at it, I have on purpose used the word hobby painters, which was to really start a debate about this and say, how should we look at it in this context?
Can I ask Vinita to join now? Vinita, you need to unmute.
Thank you very much. I was just, those are amazing questions. I loved your question about the port city. I mean, Amitav Ghosh wrote this incredible book on climate called The Great Derangement, where he talks about the hubris of 19th century colonial empires compared to the early modern empires. And he makes precisely the point that you made, that, and I'm not an architect, so the sort of sites that they chose showed you the hubris of these empire builders, because they completely negated the earlier thinking and planning that went into port cities in the 16th century, Venetian ports, and you mentioned Mahabalipuram and so on, Mamallapuram. So in some senses, I think they paid for it, because I've worked on the Calcutta cyclone of 1864, which completely destroyed Port Canning, which, as it was being built, the British Piddington, who invented the term cyclonology, was trying to tell the administrators, don't build the port here, it's going to be destroyed. And sure enough, they built it, and it was destroyed by the 1867 cyclone of Calcutta, which took out 1/3 of the population of Calcutta, right? At that time, right? So very, very similarly, I think it's quite interesting if you, and this is one of the projects that we want to do as part of our Center for Environmental History work, is to map the cyclonic events in Madras as well, and to look at particularly the sort of events that are happening, like what happened last week in Chennai, and to see the number. And so these sort of correspondences, I think, are quite useful for us, along with the missionary archives, and of course the more scientific data that you get from someone like Roxburgh, in 1782, as he was functioning as he was working in the Madras Meteorological Observatory, and his recordings and his diaries. So your second question was, why were the sisters painting this way, and was it unnatural? Now, this is very interesting. They might have fallen into, you know, because if you think of the way in which the great El Nino, the most devastating sort of period that Richard Grove highlights as being the period between 1785 and 1795, this mega El Nino, La Nina, drought in South India sort of period, which sort of also coincides with the Chalisa famine in South India and the Dola, you know, the skull famine, which, you know, takes away about 11 million people, including the impact in South India. So they probably came just after that, and they were just the beginning of the onset of the second phase of drought, which was, you know, 1804, 1807. They're talking about scarcity, but not full-blown drought. So that is also now in the British record as quite a serious drought and famine, right? In South India, right? So it could be that they are in between that period. Otherwise, they are sort of living in an ivory tower, you know, in some senses, as you say, or not moving beyond their radius. So where were they traveling? I would be more interested to know that. I haven't looked at the material enough to know how far afield they were going. Yeah, and that would be quite interesting if they were traveling further afield, say, you know, 40 miles away or 50 miles away or 60 miles away. Did they hit Chinglepet, for example? Chinglepet was having a scarcity, according to this very interesting paper that I've quoted. You know, quite serious scarcity in 1802, in the same period, right? And the agriculturalist was suffering in terms of food and famine and scarcity. So that is that question. And the last question about what seeds survived, I'm sorry, I'm not in a position to answer that. I think someone like Henry Nolte would be able to answer that question. Because I haven't looked into the seeds they brought back and the seeds that may or may not have survived. Yeah.
Can I just comment on one thing? Why they paint the way they did? It's a worthwhile question. Certainly their training is very important to reflect on, and I tried to touch on that a little bit. But if we look at other artists who came and they had come to really explore and travel, so their coverage, the territories that they covered, Hodges or Daniels, or later in the 19th century, Lear's painting. They came, Lear traveled from 1873 to 75. His style of painting really comes close to what Two Sisters are doing. He kind of with emotion paints out things. So there are certain training as well as other relations. Even though I'm quoting Kipling's quatrain and saying, when all the, we say, what did I say? When Earth's last picture is painted and tubes are twisted and dry. Tube colors did not exist when sisters were painting. Tube colors were developed only in 1830s. So the amount of paint that the sisters had to work with was very limited, little cakes. So the washes that they use with economy, light tones, you just dilute things and then give. That is so very important to understand this technically in this production of how you write with a computer and how do you write longhand are two very different engagements. Similarly, when you don't have enough paint even, or you have limited supply of paint, how do you do it? The size of paper that you have is another thing, what happens in this. So these are also important aspects to think about.
Thanks, Vikram. There's a question from Victoria, but how at the end she says the question has been answered. But how, Victoria, in the interest of all the participants, do you like to unmute and ask yourself that question?
I did not get the question very clear.
So you'll have to
Okay.
read out the chat questions. Yeah.
Okay, let me read it.
I can't open them for some
Victoria
reason.
writes that I'm very impressed with the depth of the context you had added to the materials, particularly the ideas about underlying darkness of natural and human-made disasters, from typhoons to war. This speaks of the individual's experience of his or her time. Do you think that Sister's almost Arcadian vision is a product of the period at which they visit, or only their fortunate circumstances? But she quickly adds, because by the time you had dwelt on that, and she says, I think you just answered.
Answer that, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so
Thank you.
thanks for
Yeah,
the
yeah.
comment. So there's another question here. So thanks to the panelists. Could you comment on how and by whom systems of water storage and distribution were maintained in this period? How were these systems impacted by warfare and by colonial rule? Did the EIC make any efforts to maintain these systems?
I mean, this is something that Vikram, I would really like, because I love that map that Vikram showed about the aquifers and the water bodies in the late 18th century sort of map. And I think the whole story of aquifers and rivers and the water systems, because I met someone from the British Geological Survey recently who was going off to India to map their aquifers. I said, why don't you use the legacy data that we've got? You know, why are you reinventing the wheel every time to find out what you unblock in terms of the lakes and the ponds in Bangalore and so on? So here is this huge legacy that we've got of British mapping of these aquifers. We need, and something, a project like this can do a lot about it, you know, can in some senses, as you said, not just reinvigorate urban design, can reinvigorate the way in which we understand and map the environment, because the British created a whole doomsday book of natural history. Yeah, this is a veritable doomsday book in terms of the largest collections in Kew, the Natural History Museum, are from India, right? So if we just, and the Gwillim sisters, of course, is just the tip of the iceberg. And I think for this whole water history of India as well, this is these sort of sources are quite invaluable. And of course, both the Kuam River and the Adyar River today are one of the most polluted rivers in the world, you know. And of course, when they were writing about it, it was sweet scented and full of fish.
You're absolutely right. In fact, after the post-2015 disastrous urban floods, people are scrambling to get these colonial records, which maps or describes this extensive system of tanks that irrigated this whole northern Tamil Nadu and Chennai in particular. You're absolutely right there.
Yes.
Yeah.
The Madras Survey School, whatever they did, which became the Guindy Engineering College, is established in 1794. And what were their curricula and how people were trained. So there is another set of information which is available from different sources, as Vinita says, which is right in Madras around this. So that is a very important source to work from. I don't know what kind of archives exist locally there, or how the archives were transferred from the survey school. The same was the challenge with the Surveyor General of India when I worked on my hill station books. That was the kind of a historical event, I should say. When I approached the British Library, Dr. Cook was just about to throw away all he was in charge of all the maps, and they said, now we have Google Maps and so on. There was a standing order that the maps will be sent to Oxford and Cambridge, as well as to the India office and to via the India office came to the British Library, and they were just going to get rid of them because this was just old paper which was taking up too much space. So now at least we have a very good archival records existing in place at the British Library of the old maps. And if you look at the quality of work which was done by the Surveyor General of India and the survey. So what are the kinds of information which is collected in there? Of course, as I said, strategic and defense issues were very important, but as Vinita and you both mentioned, there were many other layers of information included in this. This is, as an architect, urban designer, we function reading maps to a great detail, but I would say anybody can do the same thing. Now, nobody goes traveling without consulting Google Maps. Which is the location for the hotel, or where the beach is close by or not. So that when you imagine you are halfway around the globe and you're going into the strangest of the places, this was a very powerful tool that one has at hand.
Thanks, Vikram. I think we're coming to the end of this conversation. One final question, and after that, we will wrap up. So here is the question. The sisters were quite positive about their ability to adapt to the Indian climate. Later colonial writers were more negative. Do you agree with Suman Seth, Mark Harrison, and others that this had to do with the hardening racial boundaries? That's the idea that Europeans were inherently unsuited to Indian climates. Quick response and we can.
I think yes, but it did not happen overnight. Certainly the establishment of the territories and control, which increases the power, becomes very strong. But the number of women who came to the subcontinent jumped dramatically from 1830s onwards. 1830s, when tall ships are slowly getting replaced by steam navigation. This is when the number of women who arrive jumps dramatically. And then all classes of Britishers or Europeans who were coming were there, and women would come. They used to be called fishing or flying fleets, which they would come in and to find a husband even. And that were in the literature, you can find descriptions about it, which talks about returned empty, those who couldn't find a husband. But that number changes. And when we see this colonial structure very strongly established, happens in the establishment and the layout of all the hill stations. This is around that from 1830 to 1850s. It is very severe.
Yeah, a quick response. I think that's quite interesting that you mark that date, because I was also pleasantly surprised to find that the sisters that they talked about death. There wasn't the sort of David Arnold Tropics and the Traveling Gaze sort of how this was the graveyard of most Britishers who came here, and that was again because of the way in which I think Vikram has just sort of marked it. 1830s marks when they came in greater numbers. But I still think that there were lots of letters there which were sort of had borders marked in black, which is about grief and the dead and the dying, both in England, the precarity of life, both back home and in India for children and for young people. There was a sense of it, but they were not overwhelmed by it. And I think that is quite interesting. And I think that's a point that you've just made very well. Why was that? And I think it's just about the numbers that came and what happens to them later. And probably also the landscape became much more disease ridden as they took more resources out, as they deforested, malaria became more intense and so on. So that would again be quite to see how disease spreads as well.
And Company was ruthless. Let us be very frank about it. They did calculations, and I described those calculations in my previous works, where they counted and said, each soldier is costing us 100 pounds. If that soldier goes to the field and dies, we lose money. He should go and fight, or at least stay alive and defend, or at least create the red jackets, which would create a presence of the army. So the calculations, if you count, they say they did real calculations and say it is very important to invest in certain kinds of things because they are dying like flies coming into this area. So therefore, how we should create these settlements, how we should establish the health establishments and so on. These are very important questions. The soldiers who came had no means. Each and every camp has camps for harlots. Harlotry was permitted and legalized by the company to keep the soldiers who were there at least satisfied. On top of it, they went further in this, and they not only they had surveys of their health and sicknesses and syphilis. So
I'm sure there's a lot more to say and speak, and we already overshot the time. Thank you both.
Thank you, Mr. Srivathsan.
Over to you, Victoria.
Well, I want to thank both speakers. I was absolutely fascinated by so many things in your presentations, from the notion of the darkness, Vinita, which just it's really taken to me, and the great derangement, and also this notion of water and the importance of the environment as we see it at the time, the transition from lushness to drought. I mean, there's so many things we can take out of this. So thank you both for a fabulous presentation, and you, Srivathsan, for your wonderful moderation, your comments. And I want to thank all the participants for attending this final session of Gwillim Online. I'm sort of sad that it's all over, at least this iteration, because I think we've learned so much. We never thought when we were forced to postpone the Montreal Symposium last spring that the virtual alternative would be so rewarding. On behalf of the Gwillim Project team, I'd like to thank all those who've presented and those who've joined us to watch, listen, and pose thoughtful questions. I also want to thank all those who worked on the symposium, including our student research assistants. Merci de votre présence aujourd'hui, and we'll look forward to keeping in touch as we continue to explore the experience of the Gwillims and those among whom they lived and worked in early 19th century Madras. Thank you again, everyone, and we'll look forward to seeing you online again. Take care.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.
thank you, Srivathsan, for
Thank you, Vikram. Thank
your
you.
very informative question. Thank you, Victoria. Thank you, Vinita, being such a great part.